amidst the pages of history, an enthralling tale unfurls. A tale of Gustav Revver, a German veteran whose life trajectory led him to the esteemed 2nd Paratroop Panzer Grenadier Division, Hermann Göring. Originally destined for the boundless skies of the Luftwaffe, fate charted a different course, thrusting Gustav onto the harrowing Eastern Front as an unassuming infantryman. Join us now on this captivating odyssey through Gustav's extraordinary journey, a narrative etched with twists of fate and unwavering resilience that will leave you spellbound. Let's travel back to the year 1924, where in the charming town of Osnabrück, North Germany, a young life came into the world. Fast forward to 1942, a pivotal year as I stood on the cusp of adulthood, having just graduated from high school in Freiburg. The call of duty beckoned, and with dreams as high as the clouds, I decided to take a leap of faith and join the ranks of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. My heart brimmed with the hope of becoming a pilot, a dream that would soon take flight. But the story was just beginning. My journey didn't unfold in the heartland of Germany. Instead, destiny sent me across the borders to Nancy, a picturesque town nestled in the heart of France. It was here, against the backdrop of stunning landscapes and a foreign culture, that I would undergo my basic military training. Little did I know then that this was just the opening chapter in an extraordinary adventure that would test my mettle and forge my destiny. In March 1943, I wrapped up my basic military training, and the next chapter of my military journey took me to an Air Force base in Holland, where I hung around until mid-year. Being part of the German military at that time filled me with an incredible sense of pride. I vividly remember the moments on guard duty when I had the chance to get up close and personal with the awe-inspiring Focke-Wulf 190 planes. Now, picture this. It was summertime, and Allied aircraft had paid a visit, leaving our flying field looking like Swiss cheese with craters ranging from 5 to 15 meters deep. My buddies and I were handed the job of filling them up with rocks and soil, working together like a well-oiled machine to keep that runway in shape. Then came a twist in the tale. We got word to extend the runway, and initially, we thought it was some kind of prank. But as it turned out, it wasn't a joke. They were actually preparing for Messerschmitt Me-262 planes, a newfangled aircraft without those old-school propellers. Unfortunately, I got shuffled off to a different assignment before those marvels touched down. Life in the military was full of surprises. In the spring of 1944, my military journey took an interesting turn. I was dispatched to southern Germany for training at a gliding school, which was the initial step to becoming a pilot. There, we delved into various subjects, including navigation and meteorology, but it wasn't long before I got my hands on a small single-engine aircraft for flight practice, guided by an instructor. However, fate had a different plan in store for many of us. Around May or June of 1944, a notice arrived, and it brought unexpected news. My fellow cadets and I were informed that we were being reassigned from our aviation training, possibly to a Luftwaffe division, or even just infantry units. The reason? The severe shortage of fuel was caused by relentless Allied air attacks on the Romanian oil fields. It was a tough break, even for experienced bomber aircrew members, many of whom held military honors and found themselves joining the infantry. Without much delay, we were whisked off to the Eastern Front in the middle of that summer. There, we encountered a massive Russian offensive, which wreaked havoc on the units we joined. This offensive led to the demise of the Army Group Center. Initially, we had hoped to be sent to Italy, which doesn't sound too bad at all, but my comrades and I ended up being assigned to the 22nd Paratroop Panzer Grenadier Division, Hermann Göring. At the time, the division was stationed in defensive positions along the Vistula River to the south of Warsaw. My role? I served as a machine gunner in the infantry company, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. Honestly, I was scared out of my wits during that whole time. When I found myself on the front lines in October 1944, my days were consumed by digging trenches and dugouts, especially during the first few weeks, and mostly at night. Those nights felt endless, and the Russian flares they fired into the sky seemed to burn brighter and longer than our German ones. I had the role of a machine gunner armed with an MG-42, which came with its own set of challenges, typical of the final year of the war. I grew increasingly frustrated with the 7.92mm cartridges we used. Their steel castings were lacquered to prevent rust, because brass and copper alloys for normal castings were in short supply, especially compared to the early war days. The lacquered cartridges were causing problems, jamming the machine gun's side as the lacquer melted and bulged from the heat. Another issue with the MG42 was its high rate of fire. This rapid firing heated up the barrel quickly, diminishing the gun's accuracy and causing frequent jams. To counter this, and with no time to replace the barrel, my assistant occasionally covered it with snow to keep it cool. He was armed with an MP-44 assault rifle, which he used to keep the Russians at bay while I reloaded the machine gun or swapped out the overheated barrel. Getting ready for an offensive was quite a nerve-wracking experience. The Russians had a habit of bombarding our positions with their mortars, which were their go-to weapon. What made it even more challenging was their tactic of firing smoke shells for about 10 minutes before launching their offensive. This dense smoke reduced our visibility to just 10 meters, leaving us practically blind. The Russians also had these 76mm artillery guns that we called Ratchbombs. They fired directly and the shells burst over the ground, making it hard to find adequate cover in the open trenches. It seemed like their goal wasn't necessarily to kill us straight out, but to knock a soldier out and force 2 or 3 of his buddies to leave the front line to get him to safety, weakening our defenses right before their offensive. Sometimes we couldn't even set up wire fences in front of our trenches to slow down the Russian attacks, simply because we ran out of wire. But we improvised by placing mine obstacles, which turned out to be quite effective, but also had a second line of trenches about 200 meters behind the main one, where we'd retreat to whenever the Russians managed to break through our first line of defense. It was all about adapting and holding our ground. The second line of trenches was always buried under a blanket of snow, which was a real hassle when we had to jump into it. Imagine the shock of landing in there and then having to clear out all that snow from the trenches. Now there was another interesting weapon the Russians liked to use on the Eastern Front during the night: biplanes. We had a humorous nickname for them, calling them flying sewing machines. These aircraft would drop bombs on anything unlucky enough to be below them at night. One day, a pilot from one of these planes got a bit mixed up and mistook our German positions for Russian ones. He made an unexpected attack, which actually gave us a good laugh. Quite a rarity during those days on the Eastern Front. These planes also dropped leaflets, trying to persuade us to surrender and making it clear that the war was pretty much lost. One memorable incident involved a Russian patrol that lost its way in no man's land and ended up dangerously close to our positions, thinking they were headed toward the Russian side. Well, they stumbled right into our ambush and found themselves under fire from us. The Russians quickly beat a retreat, dropping all their weapons and gear in the process. During the day, our biggest concern was the Russian snipers. None of us dared to stick our heads above the parapet, knowing that these enemy marksmen were exceptional shots. It was a constant threat that we had to be wary of. Continuing our exploration of the remarkable memoirs of a German soldier in the Panzer Grenadier Division. If you're as captivated by this journey as I am, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay updated on our historical adventures. Now, back to the incredible story. Our attire in those bitter winters was quite something. We were decked out in these blue wadded jackets and matching pants, which was standard winter gear in the Luftwaffe. Oddly enough, our field caps had nothing to do with the Luftwaffe. There was a mismatch there. To stay concealed, we layered up with camouflage jackets and winter pants. Winter made things even trickier because, honestly, we couldn't afford to take off any clothes. It was just too cold. I never even got my hands on a blanket, so I ended up sleeping in my clothes. Thankfully, I lucked out with my footwear. I had those sturdy boots they issued to paratroopers. Those boots were a lifesaver, keeping my feet warm and dry, unlike some of the other Army-issued shoes. I wore those boots for months because I was constantly stationed on the front lines, with the ever-present threat of a Russian attack. Oh, and instead of regular socks I opted for Fusslappen, which helped keep my feet a bit drier in the mucky trenches. Just like most of my comrades, I sported a standard helmet, although our platoon commander, a lieutenant, was rocking an airborne helmet. I always wondered if he'd served as a paratrooper before. I even had a Red Army soldier's belt. One day, while on the lookout for food and valuable items, I stumbled upon the frozen remains of a Russian soldier and managed to nab that belt from him. But it wasn't Soviet soldiers that posed the biggest threat. It was the relentless weather. It felt like a never-ending cycle of rain, mud, biting cold, snow, and relentless winds. For a grueling 5 months straight, I lived in the trenches of Poland and East Prussia. No shelter, no roof over my head, just constant cold and damp. Our defensive time in East Prussia was quite a setup. It featured an anti-personnel mined strip, a main line of zigzag trenches, and a secondary defensive line with a series of gun positions connected by intersecting trenches. About 200 meters behind one of these positions, there was a farm where the company field kitchen parked to dish out our daily or evening rations. Speaking of rations, they were quite basic, even limited to a bread ration. We'd get a hot meal once a day, typically potato and vegetable soup, because meat was becoming a rarity, even at the front. I distinctly remember receiving a special ration pack marked "For infantrymen on the front lines only," which contained cookies, dried fruit, cigarettes, instant coffee, and glucose tablets. On another occasion, I received a package that held nothing but breadcrumbs. I was perpetually hungry, so much so that whenever I came across a fallen soldier, my first instinct was to check him for any provisions. I'd rifle through pockets and gear, whether they belonged to my comrades or enemies. Unfortunately, when a friend fell in combat, I searched his body too. It was the only thing left to do. Some of the essentials like foot powder or a set of sewing needles and thread were handed out to those lucky enough to be in occupation units stationed in Denmark or Norway. These folks had the luxury of time to do things like sewing on buttons. But honestly, at the front, tasks like button sewing and uniform maintenance were pretty rare. We had more pressing concerns, like trying to stay alive. When we weren't bedding down in the trenches keeping close to the front lines, my comrades and I never sought shelter in buildings. It was just too risky due to the Russian artillery aiming at such structures. Instead, we'd find the nearest woods and hunker down there. As our army faced shortages of basic necessities, some equipment became increasingly popular. One notable example was the Holzkocher. It was basically a wood-burning stove mounted on a truck, right behind the driver's cab. You could burn these small 4x4x4 centimeter wooden blocks in it, and it was believed that these stoves helped the vehicles save on fuel. But, truth be told, they spewed out more soot, were quite unreliable, and didn't provide enough power. For a 30 to 50 kilometer trip, you'd have to burn through a whopping 10 bags of those wooden blocks. We even had a running joke about it. Germany created a new 70-ton supertank with a heavy gun and strong armor that would destroy any tank of the Allies. The catch? To get it moving, you needed 20 tankers behind the turret chopping wood. Discipline in some of those renowned units, like the ones carrying the Hermann Göring name, could be brutally unforgiving. I'll never forget the day when an officer intercepted 3 soldiers walking along the road away from the front lines. He accused them of desertion on the spot and without hesitation executed them using an MP-44. I stood there in shock, witnessing the entire ordeal. Once the officer was out of sight, my comrades and I approached the lifeless bodies searching for food. On March 15, 1945, during the battle near Heiligenbeil, I sustained a leg wound. Oddly enough, I didn't even notice it until my shoe filled with blood. A piece of shrapnel had struck the flesh behind my left knee, thankfully missing any major arteries or bones. Determined not to be captured, I'd seen what had happened to wounded men in Russian hands. I made my way to the battalion dressing station, all on my own. The station was housed in a large barn, where numerous soldiers, some with more severe wounds, awaited treatment. I'll never forget the officer in line ahead of me. He was so shell-shocked that he couldn't comprehend the orderly's questions. The scenes from there were nothing short of horrific. I witnessed surgeons operating on conscious soldiers without anesthesia. Once my wound had been cleaned, I, along with several others, was transported by truck to the harbour and loaded onto a boat for Palau. I distinctly remember a Russian air raid during our journey, with one plane flying so close that I could see the gunner's face. Eventually, we were transferred to a larger vessel en route to Copenhagen. By then, an infection had set in, rendering my left leg numb, and I feared I might lose it. Surgeons aboard the ship treated my wound, but I felt nothing. My recovery at a Copenhagen hospital was surprisingly swift, though I remained there until May 8, 1945. Come August 1945, I found myself in Kiel, within the British occupation zone. Upon disembarking, British soldiers confiscated virtually everything we had: pocket knives, watches, pens, and more. However, they spared our military awards as a mark of respect. All in all, the British treated us quite well, providing us with good meals and distributing pamphlets that laid blame on Germany for starting the war and emphasized Adolf Hitler's role in the millions of deaths. They also informed us that the German industry would be thoroughly dismantled to prevent future conflicts. In September 1945, I obtained permission to return to Osnabrück, a city that had suffered 75% destruction due to bombing raids. Then, in 1957, during a leave in Yugoslavia, I met my future wife, who happened to be a US citizen. We tied the knot, and I emigrated to America, settling in Indianapolis. where I worked as a civilian in the US Navy until my retirement. Now, as I prepare for bed each night, I often find myself reminiscing about those moments on the Eastern Front. After nearly 70 years, it's a challenge to accept that no one will burst into my bedroom shouting about a Russian attack. There's no longer a need for me to sprint to my fire point in the trenches, readying my trusty MG42 for battle. And that's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and support the channel with your subscription. Goodbye to everyone, and see you later.